I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, women on porn.
Isn't that nice?
When you think about women and pornography, more than likely you think of women in pornography as the objects of porn, starring in porn. Or perhaps, given the current political events, you think of Stormy Daniels. But rarely do people think of women as consumers of porn, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Primarily because our culture pushes women's sexual desires to the sidelines. And that's what today's guest is here to talk about. Fiona Vera-Gray led a study called Women on Porn, and it was the largest ever study solely focused on the range of women's experiences and views on porn in the UK. She gathered the views of 2,000 women, and she also conducted 100 in-depth interviews about women's relationship to mainstream online pornography. And what she uncovered was really fascinating. So here is Fiona Vera-Gray describing why she decided to conduct this study.
So it's a project that's looking at women's experiences of mainstream online pornography. So why it came up was I was looking into, I can't remember why actually, I was looking into just, the idea of kind of sexual agency, again, freedom, because I'm quite interested in women's freedom and thinking about sexual freedom and agency, and pornography is both an enabler and a disabler of that for women, both blocking and maybe offering some possibilities, and so I started to look into some research because I thought, there's clearly going to be some research on this, and there's nothing, and I was so surprised that there's just been hardly any. There's been more in the last couple of years. It's starting to come out, but I was looking at this in I think 2014, 2015. But there was very, very little talking to women about their experiences with and relationships to mainstream online porn. So where it had been done, it would focus on women using feminist pornography or things like erotica or written, books and things like that. But, women talking about their experiences of using Pornhub, for example, was only ever found Pornhub releases statistics. And so you could use their statistics, but I don't really trust companies' statistics and on things. It's done for different reasons. But yeah, so it was still this idea that women don't access this kind of material, and also the research that has been done around women and consumption and pornography completely excludes the women that don't access pornography, that don't look at pornography, that have a relationship of refusal to it. And what I wanted to do was to look at those two things together, basically, and not just those two things, to look across the breadth of women's relationships. So women who use it frequently, women who have used it a couple of times, women who have used it with a partner, women who don't use it but their partner uses it and they have an experience of that. Younger women talking about, sexual encounters with men who use a lot of pornography. So I wanted to just be able to understand a little bit more about what actually is women's relationships to mainstream online porn. What do they think? How does it make them feel? And to kind of think about how we can start to reorient some of the theory around pornography to come from women's actual accounts rather than just from the heads of academics.
What was really interesting, this is more of an observation than a question, but when I was thinking about this conversation yesterday, I was thinking about the tenor of the conversation, what questions I would ask. I don't know, I had this kind of internal giddiness, kind of a silliness around it. And I thought, where is that coming from, right? Our culture treats women's sexuality, especially their interest in porn or, those romantic novels, as kind of a joke, right? Kind of a punchline. And I thought, well, but for men, it's quite a serious affair, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no space. So this is the biggest thing that I've found so far, is that there is no space for women to talk about this stuff. And so because really similar again to the sexual harassment stuff, there are links between the two. It sounds like I've gone off completely separately, but there's totally links. And one of them absolutely is, again, that there's no space for women to talk about how this feels unless what they're saying is either I really love it or I really hate it. That's the only space that's available. So women who use porn, who find it really fulfilling, who love it, who might have performed in it or be directors, absolutely there is a space for women to say, yeah, I use porn and I love it. It's great. And then on the other hand, there's absolutely a space for women to say, I do not use pornography. I find it all violent. It makes me feel ill. I don't use it at all. But what there's not, and what I've found is that for the majority of women, they sit in that middle bit, is for women, that a space for women to say, you know, I use it sometimes and I feel pretty shitty about it sometimes. And I've come across things that have made me feel complicit in gender inequality and sexism, and I've come across things that have made me feel really bad, and sometimes I'm worried about the women, but I do actually still use it, you know, and I negotiate my use around these things. And there's been no space for women to say that because, like with the sexual harassment stuff, women are blamed or judged, and there's so much judgment around women's sexuality anyway, that there's been a huge silence around this issue. And I don't think that served women very well, because it's meant that we've had to kind of, I guess, hide part of our experience to either fit into those box of it's great, I love it, or I never use it, I hate it, which isn't to say that there's not women who occupy those spaces, but I just don't think that the majority of women sit so securely in one box or the other.
You'd worked in a rape crisis center. How did that work lead you to this project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess that's kind of how I got there, really, to be honest, which sounds odd, but it's not. So what I used to do was I did some frontline support work and that kind of thing, but also I really focused on doing prevention. So we did workshops in schools with kids and workshops on workplaces and training to professionals, all of those kind of things. But it was mainly the kids side of things that we were going in and talking about sexual consent. And this was, you know, a good few years ago. And so it was before maybe it's as popular as it is now. And we were testing out different things and seeing what we were getting right and what we weren't getting right. And I just started over time to think, you know, we're focusing a lot on consent, for example, was a big thing, you know, focusing on enthusiastic consent and the idea that you don't want not a no, you want like an enthusiastic yes. And then when I started thinking about that, I was thinking, you know, is this really how sex happens, like as an adult? Really, is it that someone kind of
Right.
like poses the question and the other person says yes or no? I mean, it's not, and I think that kids can see that, you know, kids are, particularly teenagers, they're really good at seeing when adults are trying to tell them something that isn't necessarily true. I think they can kind of see through it. And I didn't want the message that we were giving, which was really important message around the importance of making sure that your partner is into what's happening. I didn't want that to be lost, because the idea of consent actually doesn't entirely fit with how sexual interaction happens. And so I started to think about that, and how when we talk about consent, a lot of the time we actually, even as feminists, we're still positioning women as being the gatekeepers of sex. You know, it's very rare when we're talking about consent, even if we don't gender it, we're not often talking about the fact that it's women initiating sexual activity. You know, we're not really talking to boys about how do you say enthusiastically yes, or how do you say no. You know, we're talking to girls because it's taken as a default that what's happening in a heterosexual interaction is that men and boys are asking, and women and girls are either agreeing or refusing. And even that, you know, if the best that we can hope for is that a woman or a girl agrees to sex, I mean, that's pretty disappointing. That's not my aim for like a happy, kind of pleasurable sexual life for people, that there's just a bunch of people agreeing. And so I think then that's when I started thinking, like, I wonder, that's, I guess, when I then started to look at the research around pornography, or more just about where is there a space for women to talk about their sexuality and their desire. And where I found that space was women talking about things like feminist pornography or that kind of thing. And then I was really surprised when I found that there was very little talking to women about using mainstream porn, even though the research on women using feminist pornography shows that they use that alongside mainstream porn. And what my research has found is that actually women aren't using feminist porn the majority of the time. The majority of porn that they're using is the free stuff, because why would you pay? That's what they've said routinely. Why would I pay? Why would I pay for something? Yeah, it's ethical, but actually porn doesn't occupy a massive part of my life. It's just a little thing that I use to get myself off if I need to. And so why am I going to pay for that? I'm just going to use the same kind of sites that are targeted to men. So it's a long story, but it makes sense in my head. That I think there's a connection between sexual violence and the lack of space that's given to women to talk about their sexual agency.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's a question that isn't really clear in my head either. Of course, sexual interactions aren't clinical. They aren't formal where, someone says, do you want to do it? And the person says,
Yeah.
yes, that doesn't happen. And so the fact that we are kind of teaching children that, first of all, is kind of dishonest, I think, in a sense, or it isn't giving them a realistic picture of what they can expect. But, also, you're right. What's being excluded is how women think and women's desire.
Totally. And women as the initiators. I mean, that's another thing that, again, from this porn project that we're starting to see, because alongside it, we've done a content analysis of the top 3 porn sites, so Pornhub, Xhamster, and Xvideos. We've got like 150,000 videos to look through, all the GIFs, but to look through, which is, being crazy. But again, what's coming up, and this is just emerging, but what's coming up is that, porn is replicating this idea that women aren't ever kind of the doers in sex. They do for men's pleasure, but they don't do for their own pleasure. So they don't initiate sex in the main on their own for their own pleasure. That it's done for the pleasure of a male partner. And I think that we see that kind of sexual script replicated in society. And neither of those things really help women in being able to lead fulfilling sexual lives.
Right. So I didn't know that you had to pay for what is feminist porn and alternative porn. And I think I know what mainstream porn is, but I didn't realize that you had to pay for feminist porn. But
yeah, no, I mean, a lot of so that was the other thing, was that women saying that they didn't use feminist porn because they didn't know it existed. So the idea of feminist porn is that you can make pornography that shows, in representation, that it shows something different, that it does show women as being initiators, or it isn't based on the idea of inequality, that it's not as racist as mainstream porn, that, it's not as sexist, that kind of thing. But also there's an idea that there's an ethics in the industry, and that means that people have to be paid. People have to be paid properly, and people have to be able to say yes and no to particular acts if they want to do them or not, and that, the conditions of your working life, you're given breaks, for example, all of those kind of things, sick pay, holiday pay, all of those kind of things that we very rarely think of when we think about pornography. That's kind of the back end that we don't really want to pay attention to. But feminist porn is this idea that it's not pornography that's bad, it's pornography created in the particular kind of masculine, heteronormative, capitalist system that it's in. That's what the problem is. And so when you're creating that kind of stuff, it costs money, and you have to get people to pay for it. And so there are a few, kind of different feminist porn sites and alternative porn sites. But then even now, the idea of feminist pornography is being kind of taken into the mainstream in a way, and there's some forms that will represent inequalities, or some forms that maybe aren't necessarily adhering to the particular ethical practices that you would assume. So even the term itself is, again, it's kind of diffuse and ambiguous. You can't definitely say categorically what it is or what it isn't. And the thing that I found most important in talking to women about it is, regardless, there's been so much theoretical attention from feminist academics on the possibilities of feminist pornography, but actually when you talk to women, they're not using it. But there's been an overdominance in theory in focusing on alternative porn, queer porn, feminist porn for women, instead of actually looking at, what are women saying about mainstream, commercial, run-of-the-mill, free-to-view pornography?
right. And the fact that the women that you interviewed who had looked at feminist porn or alternative porn also used mainstream porn, I find that really interesting because I would imagine that the end result of the goal is the same.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm not really sure what the content is, but, I was thinking about that. And I was thinking about the fact that a woman's relationship to mainstream porn and the consumption of it, men and women are shaped by the same media diet, right? And the same objectification of women, our sexual lives, the way that we think, they're shaped by the same things that we consume. So I was thinking, like, women are sexualized in the same way that men are, in that if a woman comes across an image of a woman in a bikini draped across a sports car, there's a good chance that she would find that just as sexy as a man would find that. Do you know what I mean?
It's an excellent point. I mean, and this is, so the small amount of research that has been done, and mine completely backs it up, is that there isn't women don't have a different form of sexuality that you can examine as comparable to men. I mean, the idea that there's a woman's sexuality and there's a man's sexuality it just doesn't, isn't shown to be true. And it's exactly for the reasons that you just said. We both exist in a society that teaches particular forms of sexual scripts about what sex is, what it does, who does it, what's enjoyable, what looks sexually attractive, what practices, are sexual. And we both exist on that diet. And so absolutely that's got to influence us in some really similar ways. The difference is in how you're situated as a consumer in relationship to the people that are on screen. And so women are able to talk about, and this may be different than men, I don't know though, I can't say completely, but we're able to talk about thinking again about labor. So seeing when something doesn't look authentic in women, because, women talk about the fact that many of us have had to fake orgasms or have felt like we wanted to fake orgasms. And so we kind of have an idea of what it looks like when a woman is performing sexual pleasure. And so various women, quite a few women that I've spoken to, have spoken about this idea of authenticity and being able to see in pornography the work of it and the pretense of it sometimes, not all the time, and that being a real barrier to them experiencing pleasure. And so I'd be interested to know if that's similar to men. I'd be interested to know if men are as able to pick up a fake orgasm as women seem to feel that we're able to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess that would imply that somehow, I don't know, I guess in alternative pornography, the acting's better. I don't know.
Well, I guess the idea is that it's people doing particularly sexual acts that they actually want to do. So again, it's different across different forms, but there's some different sites that women have told me about that is, it's amateur people that are invited to go and do whatever they want to do on camera for money. And so in those kind of circumstances, the pleasure is authentic to a degree. It's still being performed, but it feels more authentic to the women watching it. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about the women saying that they feel as though they can see when a woman is faking it because they've faked it themselves is it says something about how we kind of see the outside of ourselves when we're having sex, if you know what I mean, that we think that we know what we look like when we're faking orgasm. It's ridiculous because of course we don't know what we look like, but we have a sense, we have an external view of ourselves. And that for me again ties into the sexual harassment stuff where women are encouraged to have an external view on themselves. And so it says something really interesting about our sexual bodies and how much women are allowed to be, again, how much we're allowed to be and how much we're allowed to be in our bodies, or how much we're supposed to be aware of our surroundings and aware of what we look like to others, even in that, really intensely personal experience.
Yeah, and I know you didn't question men, but do you have any idea of whether men have the same conflicts around the ethics of pornography that women have?
I don't know. I think they do have conflicts, and I don't think actually it's not really only about ethics. This is the thing that's quite interesting. There's a conflict in feeling that doesn't even go back to ethics really. So I've spoken to 100 women, and I've got a survey that's got, I think it's about 2,000 odd responses. So it's a massive data set, and particularly the interviews. You can really, like we're doing now, you can really kind of probe particular points and that kind of thing. So you get some really interesting material. And I really prefer research like that to research that's like just survey based or laboratory based. And there isn't that much kind of qualitative, which is that interviewing type research done with men. And so there hasn't been that much done with men on pornography. And so it would be hard to be able to compare them entirely. But for women, talking about that conflict, it's not only with the ethic, it is with the ethics, but it's not necessarily the ethics in the way that I thought it would be. I thought it would be, the ethics of the industry, or thinking, has that woman been exploited, or that kind of thing, which did come up for some women. But more so, it was just like a conflict in feeling that something at the same time felt good and didn't feel good. And that those two feelings were experienced together. So women talking about things like immediately after they'd come, closing the browser, shutting their laptop and pushing it away from them, wanting it away from them, not near them. And like
Yeah.
that actual effective, motion, I could see that being similar to men. So I could absolutely see some of the conflicts and the contradictions and those kind of things. Just thinking about it, a colleague, another academic, Maria Garner, did work with a small group of men, but did some qualitative work, and she absolutely found that there were conflicts, that they felt the same kinds of like both turned on and kind of turned off at the same time. And that, again, there wasn't that space for men to talk about that, because we live in a world where we talk all the time about pornography as being normal for men. Men use it, men love it, that's just the way they are. And it's not allowing enough space for men to say, maybe I use it and maybe sometimes I love it, but also there's some things in there where I go, yeah, no, I really, that doesn't actually feel good to me as a human being.
It's really funny. You talk about women, closing the browser and, pushing it away. And, that reminds me, this is just an anecdote. It's not necessarily a question. There was something going around on social media earlier this week where a man took a screenshot of an article and was making a political comment about the content of the article. And what he forgot to do was to close the other tabs.
Oh, I think I've seen
Did you see that?
Yeah.
So he had a few tabs open with porn sites. So that was really interesting. He wasn't obviously in a hurry to close those tabs.
No, so he didn't have the same kind of response. That's the thing. I mean, it's hard. Again, I don't know. Because again, I mean, the women that I've spoken to, it's not representative. This was women that wanted to talk to a researcher about pornography. So it may be that these are women who are more conflicted, so women who are very resolved. Maybe they didn't feel they had that much to say, so they didn't, come and talk to me. And so it's not representative. And it's the same with research with men. It's very hard for us to get a sense actually of, are there any differences between those two groups, and what are the differences between different men and between different women. So it's not kind of generalizable research, but I still think it's super important to actually open up a space to start talking about the ways that people use pornography and how they feel about it in a way that isn't so judgmental about how they are supposed to feel about it.
Do you have an idea of the role that pornography plays in women's friendships, right? In relation to the role it plays in men's friendships. And I'm just thinking of, myself personally and, what I see on television about men. I don't know if men share pornography or give each other tips. Like, this is a great book. But I know with women, I don't think that I know anyone that would admit to using pornography.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So that's what I mean. That's about the silence that's being kind of introduced about women speaking about this. So there are some women that I've spoken to that absolutely share things with friends and that kind of thing. But they're very much situated in that I use porn, I love it. Kind of, this is part of my identity. This is part of who I am. They're on that kind of side. And so they're very kind of fine with doing that. I think for the majority of women, it's absolutely the case that it's not shared in the same way. It's not used as a resource in the same way. So again, thinking about the differences actually, so Maria Garner's research found that she kind of theorized this idea that pornography went from being a public thing to being a private thing. So they generally found it in public spaces, which is quite interesting. Which I didn't know. So actually literally found it in the woods and things like that when they were kids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, really surprising. But I'd encourage everyone to ask men or for the men listening, honestly, it seems to be something that, they find it in the woods. It's weird. But would find it publicly, would share it. There'd be a period where it would be shared with friends, so kind of teenage, adolescence years. And then it would start to become a private practice. And as it became a private practice, they would speak about it less in terms of actually what they watch, how often they watch it, what they get off to, that kind of thing. It became very, very private for them. For women, it seems as though, again, it's the trajectory is that they find it in public, but they find it in a public way a lot of the time through men. So for the majority of women that I've spoken with, they've first seen pornography through men somehow. So either finding their dad's stash or their brother's stash, or having a male partner introduce it as something that they should watch or they should have a look at, or seeing brothers watch it, walking in when they're watching it. And it's important that that's not always experienced as bad. A lot of these women have spoken about that being them curious, what is that? That looks quite interesting. But the message that they get then is, this is for boys, this is for us, this is not for you girls. And that becomes very confusing when you realize that pornography is about sex, because it sends that message that sex is not about you girls, sex is about boys and sex is about men, and that has dangerous implications as you kind of go on. So women find it in that public space, but they don't have that middle bit of it becoming something that's public, that's shared with other women. Instead, they then will talk about when they go home doing things like Googling sex or finding some site that they watch by themselves that they don't tell anybody else about. And women talking about when they've used it with partners or have tried to talk to partners about their pornography use, that hasn't been the greatest experience for a lot of them, because it does occupy that private space. So when it becomes something that's shared with a partner, a lot of women have spoken about it as being actually distracting, or them and their partner actually not in liking the same things, and so it becoming a bit of an obstacle for sexual intimacy rather than something that brings them together. And so there seems to be slightly different trajectories in terms of women's porn use, and absolutely, like you said, it seems to be something that women take in and keep very private and don't talk to that many other women about, maybe because I have an idea that it's around the ways that these things are, the conflicts are not allowed, that women don't want to talk about really what they might get off to, because they feel that by doing that they're kind of accepting that, or saying that they think that that's a good thing, or they're going to be judged about saying that, rather than creating a space for women to say, I masturbate to porn, and sometimes I watch things that actually I really don't politically agree with, and that makes me feel quite complicated. And allowing a space for women to be able to say that, and for us to be able to talk about it with each other without trying to say, well, you need to stop, that's wrong, or pornography is great, it's great that you're exploring yourself, it doesn't matter if you find it politically difficult. Allowing both of those things to exist at the same time, I think, is really important.
Right. So why do we need this? What is the goal of having women's voices heard around how we relate to pornography?
I don't know, actually. I was just interested. This is the thing about research. It's just something that you're interested in. What I would like to be able to do, I guess, at this point it's hard because I'm in the middle of it, so I'm still analysing the data. So I've done a lot of the analysis, but I haven't finished it. And you don't know until you're writing. It's a really weird, beautiful experience, I think, doing research. A lot of the analysis comes out when you start writing it, and you start to make connections and see things come together. So it's very hard now to say what the point would be, because the point comes through the process of doing it. I wouldn't have theorized the sexual harassment stuff in the way that I do now if you had have asked me this. Do you know what I mean? During the process of doing it, I wouldn't have known where I was going to get to. And that's what's exciting. So that's what's exciting, that I don't know. But what I would like to happen is to, I guess, open up the conversation. That's the key for me, is just to open up the conversation, to be able to have the conversation that we're having now, that I think is a different conversation than the conversations I've heard. I have heard other podcasts that will talk about women and pornography, but it's, again, very much situated in that it's great. Women love it. It's cool. It's fine. It's fine, women. You can use porn. It's fine. And it doesn't allow space for, like, yeah, of course, you can do what you want to do, but also if you want to talk about bits that feel complicated, or you want to talk about the detail, or you want to talk how you feel about your partner using it, we haven't actually allowed the space for women to be able to have their voices heard around that. And as long as we're not having that space for women to talk about it, we're never going to truly kind of get to an understanding of whether or not this is something that women are experiencing as helping their freedom, and as helping them break free of some of the restrictions on their sexual space for action, or whether it's something that actually is putting in limits around them at the same time. And that's the thing, it might be both. It might be something that can both expand women's space and restrict it at the same time. And we just need to be able to create a space for women to be able to talk about that, so that then we can hopefully move the conversation on from where it is now. Because at the moment, a lot of the conversation on pornography is really stuck in this either pro or anti, either like it or you hate it. And I just want to know what, ordinary women kind of think about that.
Well, Fiona Vera-Gray, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
It's been a pleasure, Jen. Yeah, no, I've loved talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please subscribe on iTunes, and also please write a review. Those two things are the bread and butter of podcasting, and it helps other people discover the Electorette. Also, please visit Electorette on Facebook to tell me what you think, what you like and what you don't like about the podcast, and your feedback really helps me improve the show. Until next time, keep up the good fight.